Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Theology. My guest today is my friend Josh Porter, who is a writer, pastor, and former frontman of the art punk band Showbread. After years of loud music and louder questions, he now teaches and writes about radical discipleship, faith after deconstruction, and the subversive way of Jesus. He is the author of the outstanding book, Death to Deconstruction, and his recently released book, How to Die. The subtitle is Chaos, Mortality, and the Scandal of Christian Discipleship. Josh also pastors at Van City Church in Vancouver, Washington. So please welcome back to the show, the one and only Josh Porter. All right, Josh Porter, welcome back to Theology Draw. How are you doing this fine morning?
I'm great, man. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, I think this is like the third or fourth time.
Yeah. I'm
man.
trying to break some kind of record, whatever the current record is. I'm trying to break it.
Who holds our record, Kotri? Is that Joey? Joey's got to hold that record, right? Maybe Jay Newman's coming up there too. All right, so Josh, how I always like to ask pastors, how is ministry going? Are you still a pastor and still a Christian? Probably not in that order, but
those are both worthwhile questions to ask. Yes to both. I am still a pastor. I am still a Christian. I like to make these defiant claims about things that I can't possibly promise along the long trajectory of a lifetime because I can't predict the future. Mm-hmm. But I always tell people, it's like when I'm dead, they'll go like, man, he really stayed a Christian, Yeah. So that thing's not changing. I'm assuming maybe at some point in life I won't be a pastor. I still am a pastor presently. And I won't bore you with all the details. It's been a wild season of, I guess anybody who, not just pastors, anyone who carries out life in church community or with other disciples of Jesus knows it kind of oscillates between mundanity and excitement and joy. I mean, all of relational life is like this. And God, this sucks. There's conflict and, brokenness. So it's been, the last few months have encompassed all those things.
Yeah. Okay.
But overall, and this is not just a let me out of this, heavy thing. I just said overall, it has been really wonderful. It's just, it has encompassed all those things.
How many years have you been at Van City? Has it been?
We're on year 10 now, 10 for me, including the year of prep. So 9 years gathering on Sundays, 10 years as a church proper.
So you're past the honey. What is there a honeymoon? Is it 3 years or what? I feel like I feel with church plants, there's something about the 3 year mark and the 7 year mark. Mm-hmm. Is that?
Yeah, I think, I'm terrifically underread on church planting. Now, everyone was like, you need to read this and this. Yeah. God, they're boring. But I was told by people more experienced than me that, most church plants don't survive the first year. And then after the third year, they settle into some kind of rhythm of normalcy. Mm-hmm. And then, we gave ourselves permission to stop calling it a church plant around year 5. Okay. So that's when it stopped feeling like the Muppet Show.
The Muppet Show. What is your greatest joy in your pastoral role, and what is your greatest I wish this would just go away in your pastoral role?
Well, I honestly, as I don't know, pie in the sky as it sounds, when I was asked to be, it wasn't an aspiration of mine. I was doing music and writing, and a friend of mine was like, have you thought about becoming a pastor? Because I was into theology and the Bible. Mm-hmm. And he was like, I think that maybe you could communicate these ideas. And that's part of, not all of, but part of what it means to be a pastor. And so that was the thing that connected in my heart and mind, I guess. I was like, I would very much like to assist other people in some way in their discipleship to Jesus. I would very much like to, play some small part in empowering other people to be like, I very much like reading the Bible, and I like theology, and it enables me to love God better and be loved by God. And that's the same thing. that kind of thing, even really tiny, micro chips of it where people are like, oh, that was helpful. That thing that you said helped me understand this thing better. It's like, great. All the way up to really big things in which I'm, only one cog in the, like, oh, this church family came around me in some such way that enabled me to follow Jesus.
Is your primary mode of stepping into that role, is that from the pulpit, from teaching? Is it one-on-one? Is it random kind of casual relationships? I mean, obviously as a pastor, it's probably all of the above, but where's your sweet spot in that area?
I mean, yeah, and our church is small, so it inevitably encompasses everything, but and not in a like, wow, I do everything kind of way. I just mean that, we're a small community, small staff, so everyone does everything kind of thing. My primary position is like teaching on a Sunday evening, and so and I think that's like, not that I'm completely incompetent in a one-on-one capacity, but I think that's where I can arrange ideas in a way that could possibly be helpful to someone, or most helpful to someone, and maybe someone would disagree, but and then of course, yeah, I think that like the cumulative effect of having like a group of people together that follow Jesus, a lot of the encouragement that I hear that means the most to me doesn't have anything directly to do with me per se, but it's more like they're grateful for this group of people, or they're grateful for the story of this church, and through those things they've been empowered to follow Jesus, and all that in whatever form it comes. I that means a lot to me, and that's what I feel like God has asked me to do, or what I believe God has asked me to do. The other things that come with, I mean, the things that I don't like are the same things anyone doesn't like, that we all rub each other the wrong way, that, that I'm busted and so I hurt people, and people are busted so they hurt me. And then you have to go through all the rigmarole of reconciliation, which is often just as painful as the hurting. Or sometimes there's no reconciliation at all because we're so broken. So, the closer that you get, the more vulnerable you become to one another. But you can't, at least I believe, you can't follow Jesus without that proximity. So, yeah, I like this.
I would imagine. I mean, I mean, you. And I think I've said this before when you've been on. Like, you are kind of a unique pastor. I mean, you're a frontman of a punk rock band, covered in tattoos. Like and yet passionate about Christian orthodoxy, but also hold to non non-mainstream views. I mean, you and I share a lot of the same convictions about nonviolence and view of hell and other things. I would imagine you attract kind of and not that the pastor is the attraction of the church, but inevitably that's going to play a role. What kind of people does your Van City attract? I would imagine it's kind of a diverse group, right?
It is, yeah, and it's nothing that I predicted. Like all of those things you said are, true, in that I guess, like, in a lot of ways, I'm the unconventional candidate to be the quote unquote lead pastor of a church, but I often forget that those things, and not in a like, oh, I forget, it's just like you become preoccupied with other things, and forget that, oh, I guess it's kind of weird that, in some ways, that I'm the pastor. But we somehow ended up collecting for ourselves mostly young families, like families with small children, and then people who have deconstructed at some point. So that, and I think that maybe the reason for the latter is what you mentioned about, I have, and we have as a leadership team and teach, a handful of like orthodox but I guess traditional for a non-denominational quote unquote evangelical church, or however you want to describe it, because if you do come to our church on a Sunday, it resembles a lot of other non-denominational Protestant churches that you might visit on a Sunday. It's not like, wow, this place is crazy. You know what I mean? It has all the same building blocks as that you'd come to expect from this kind of church. And yet, like, we hold certain things even in our doctrinal statement about, theological things. And so maybe that's one of the things that has attracted certain people who have at least deconstructed evangelicalism, if not Christianity proper. And honestly, that's tremendously challenging because it wasn't a mission statement of mine. It's like, I want to gather around myself people who have been hurt by the church. It's really hard to pastor people who have been hurt by the church because they anticipate that you're next, and they're kind of on the edge of their seat looking for fundamentalism or what they perceive to be conservatism. But so and in many ways, like you said, like orthodoxy is something that's not just important to me. I mean, it's like that's what I think drives the Christian movement. So orthodoxy is often perceived by the recently deconstructed or the deconstructing as fundamentalism. It just depends on which shade or theological position it might be. So it's a really varied group. In some ways it looks really suburban, and in other ways it looks really like I don't know, edgy sounds like a lame word, but off the beaten path, kind of like the rabble. We don't know what we think about church. We have a ton of people who are like serving and participating in church that don't know if they believe in God. Somehow we get those people. And they're just helping make the coffee. And if someone ends up with them circled up in a group to take communion, they're like, nah, I don't know. You know what I mean?
There's that old that saying, it was a belief, behave, belong. Like, which one comes first? It sound. I mean, have you noticed, just by what you just said, the significance and power of belonging? It seems like you really front load that a bit. Does that have you seen that cultivate belief and behavior?
Yeah, I mean, well, it happened on accident because you end up with people that show up to church and they show up weekly, and then they sign up to help in some capacity, and naively early on we're like, cool, this dude or this gal like wants to help, and they're at church. So you make certain presumptions about what they must think, and sure, we don't know what they think on every little thing, but why else would they be here?
Right.
And then you realize in conversation or in greater depth of relationship that it's like, oh wow, like this person's agnostic, or they claim atheism right now but they're on the fence, or something like that, and you're like, huh, okay, well, I mean, where do you responsibly place such a person? I mean, we had to work out policy. Sounds like a really rigid word, but you had to work out, like, what do we think about what it means for someone to play bass in a worship band? Do they need to be a Christian at all? Do they need to be do they need to hold certain beliefs in tandem with the leadership? And so because of those presumptions, we had to figure those things out, and found that in navigating, I don't know, maybe, and I'm not saying like our way is the only way or the best way, but we did make certain decisions. It's like, you know what? I think it's like, it's fine. They don't know what they think. Let them come hang out. And obviously everyone's welcome at church, but like, let them participate in this capacity, or let them be involved in this capacity. And, we'll see where they go. And a lot of, and this is not like we did it, but a lot of, said people have come to faith over the years, and not in a like fireworks kind of way, which would be awesome. I would love a story where people are just like, and then they broke down in worship and like we baptized them that night, but more just like, I don't know, after the 17th cup of coffee, they were just kind of like, yeah, I think I would like to follow Jesus. You're like, great. You know what I mean?
Yeah, there is no prescribed formula. I talk about this a lot because it comes up a lot, obviously, in sexuality conversations. Everybody can come and attend a service, but how far can they get involved? And most people would say, well, leadership, we draw the line at leadership. If you're on a leadership, then you have to believe what the church believes and be living, trying to live accordingly. But what does leadership mean? Even that category can be fuzzy. So it sounds like you've taken a more generous approach to, in terms of requiring certain belief and behavioral standards for people to serve in various capacities at church.
Yeah. I mean, like, because of this unique, and maybe it's not that unique, but because of the situation in which we found ourselves, we found ourselves also having to figure out like or resolve those questions. And our church plant no one was experienced. We didn't have anyone on the whole team that we had a church that planted us and they were experienced, so we could kind of call them and say, hey, what do you do? And, but on the ground, it was just like, I don't know, what do you think? And so eventually we did come to a place where we have a doctrinal statement like most churches. And we have, even beyond that, we have certain, agreements of lifestyle that are actually on paper, and that to hold like an official like New Testament office of the church as like an overseer or as a deacon, you have to look someone in the eye and be like, I'm in agreement with these things.
Okay.
For the sake of official authority, spiritual authority.
Okay.
But then down the ladder, even certain leadership roles, like leading a small group, our small group model, or leading certain teams within the basic pragmatic stuff that helps church happen. Even, like I said earlier, you play bass in the band. It's like, no one's going to like put a doctrinal statement in your face. But, whoa, what do you think about the Holy Spirit? It's just, we do see some value in being able to plug people into certain positions of leadership that we wouldn't describe as necessarily having spiritual authority in the church, but more like you're helping alongside us facilitate this thing that we call church.
Yeah. All right. You've written a few books. You just came out with this recent one, How to Die, for my YouTube viewers. I was reading it. I've been reading it over the last couple weeks. This morning I was on my couch reading it. My son looks over and he's like, is that like one of those books where you're supposed to not do what it says to do? Then he's like, should I tell mom? Should we be concerned? I love your titles, man. I mean, you don't have any lazy, thoughtless, unprovocative titles. The subtitle is Chaos, Mortality, and the Scandal of Christian Discipleship. This is it's a very unique book. It's I don't know how to describe it. I mean, you've got like poems, you have the Nicene Creed built in, you've got some more, I guess, even the traditional, like, let's talk about, what marriage means. Like, it's still very, very creatively written. It's a really different sort of book. But that's who you are, it seems like. I mean, you're a very precise and thoughtful theological thinker, but you're also an artist. And so this book seems to merge those two. Would that be a accurate description?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, kind of by, I don't want to say accident, but like when, I mean, the process of like you pitch a book and you're like, I think, this is the idea I have, and it's kind of structured to the degree that you can show it to someone and say, this is what I want to write. But in nonfiction anyway, the traditional format is you haven't really written the thing proper most of the time when you give it to, the big wigs at the publisher. And originally there was some creative spin on it, but it was going to be a teaching, and there's nothing wrong with books like this. I've written them before. I like them, but a more traditional kind of like teaching book with discourse and, essay writing sounds really dry, but for all intents and purposes, more essay like. And I was like, I really just want, because I've been asked so many times, especially after having written this book called Death to Deconstruction, which leaves people in a place at the conclusion of the book that some of them were like, okay, well, I would like to be a Christian. What is it? So what is the Christian movement? Because that book talks a lot about orthodoxy, and it talks a lot about the failures of certain, like expressions of church. And so they're like, well, great, I would like back in, but what is back in? And so what's the essence? And I think that in the modern kind of, American Protestant non-denominational thing, there's a whole lot of like rediscovering the ancient practices of the church and all that kind of stuff. a lot of which is really wonderful, but it creates a sort of like, so what is the actual expression of Christianity? And when I see this one, does that mean that one's fake? And you have to look for these things. And do you have a book on that? And my answer was always like, well, I've got like a stack of really wonderful books, but no. So I was like, well, what if you did have like a single manual that couldn't possibly cover everything, but it would give you like kind of a sweeping, grandiose, like this is the big story. And that's what I pitched. And it was going to be more sermony and more teaching, something more like Death of Deconstruction or stuff that I've written in the past. And then you realize like this book is boring because you're trying to talk about the greatest story ever told and like the essence of the human condition and the love of God. And it keeps coming out like a textbook entry, no matter how like florid I make the writing. And so I started to try to like, let me read other people for inspiration. And Brennan Manning ended up being one of the bigger inspirations for the book. And his writing is way less essay-like. If you've read any of the like more noteworthy or well-known, books like Abba's Child or the Ragamuffin Gospel, they almost feel like journal entries that climax to some kind of beautiful point, and he cobbles them together from like personal anecdotes and a quote from Flannery O'Connor, and then here's this thing and ta-da, and then the next chapter starts, and it doesn't even have the traditional linear progression. I'm going to make this point, this point, this point, this point. And so I was reading writers like Manning, and then a lot of writers who kind of write outside of the Christian tradition, but write books, nonfiction that's outside of the expectation of what nonfiction usually is. And was like, I don't know, I'll just try it like this and see what happens. And you realized like, so to tell the story of Christianity, you got to do like the meta narrative of the Bible, easy, and you got to do like the Sermon on the Mount, no big deal. And to do those kinds of things in a non-essay form, it gets weird really fast. Weird in a way that was exciting to me. Like when I realized, I was like, I'm just going to try it like this, and maybe I'll give it to the publisher, and they'll be like, "Dude, what the heck is this thing that you've written?" But when I found that the voice of the book, I was like, this makes sense to me. And it still is the one volume manual that you hand to someone and be like, well, this is the story. But it's like you said earlier, it's not the kind of that's like, what the heck? There's no 3-point takeaway at the end of the chapter. It's more like, but part of me thought like, well, that's consistent with the story of the scriptures. The scriptures don't present themselves in essay form or in a way that's immediately and easily digestible either. So at the very least, it's, kind of the same spirit of the story of God, which is provocative and mysterious, but also at times really clear. And then you end up with a really weird book.
It is interesting how diverse the genres are in scripture that are directly kind of referring to the gospel in particular. We know the Bible's filled with different genres, but even the gospel story is about a narrative about, a virgin birth, and it's also a parable about a pearl of great price. It's also, a kind of a wild sci-fi story about a dragon trying to kill a woman, and like, but that captures the diversity of the human experience too, doesn't it? I mean, I think that's intentional, that there's so many different genres and different ways and angles through which the scripture talks about the gospel. It's not just a creed, although there are creeds, 1 Corinthians 15, and so on. So it does. Does that just kind of come intuitively to you because you do have this like hardcore, like theological, more left brainy ability to analyze theology, but then this like hardcore, like really creative side, like did this book, did it just come out of you, or did you kind of plan like, all right, this time I'm gonna be a little more like linear, and this time I'm gonna be a little more poetic? Or
it was like both things in tandem, meaning that once I kind of wrap my mind around, well, I'm going to take this approach and just see what happens. You know, like then it became a little less outliney, you know, because when you're writing something that's kind of essay structure, you outline it based on, I mean, a lot of Christian nonfiction that you read, in the introduction, you'll get this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to make this point, then this point, so that you'll see this. And it's helpful. You're like, great. Okay. I see the map. I know where we're going. And I did have a map in terms of like, well, you know, I divided into 3 books. Part 1, I'm going to do stories from the Bible that will make any of this make sense in theory. And then in the second book, I'll do the Sermon on the Mount. And then in the third book, I'll do the practical stuff. And even when you sit down like that, so I was like, great, that makes sense to me. And I made the decision that I'm like, one of the challenges I gave myself is I want to finish it without any footnotes. Because a book without footnotes means that, you know, like I'm relying on storytelling less than like quotes or citations. And, you know, my previous books are absolutely, like most Christian nonfiction, they're filled with footnotes. And then you can't call on somebody else's expertise, at least not in the specific sense. So it's like, even doing something like the Sermon on the Mount, you know, I'm reading all these other smarter people and then trying to communicate what they're communicating about the context and history and of the Sermon on the Mount, but without actually stopping to say, so in the first century, you know what I mean? Like, you're just trying to build that into time and keep it like Jesus, small sound bites, you know, that are really provocative and packed. And like you said, as soon as you even start to mess with the Sermon on the Mount, you're like, golly, he in one little block of teaching will do like plain speech discourse, a word picture, a metaphor, some crazy theological allusion to the Old Testament, and then something offensive. And it's like, so do that. And then he just moves on to the next thing, you know? And so you've got to find some way to pack all that in to, you know, 2 or 3 pages, because in your ordinary New Testament, it's like, you know, 3 inches of teaching. And so I'm like, okay, well, here's what Scott McKnight said. How do you translate that into this and N.T. Wright's idea about whatever, you know? Once I was like, all right, I know what I want to do, that makes it easier. But I used to, when I was like, I would take little writing breaks to go work on this freaking book. And every time I would be texting my wife, and I kept calling it this stingiest book ever, because it felt like you'd agonize over like 2 sentences and be like, okay, those are good. Those are some good sentences. Whereas ordinarily with less parameters, I could kind of like, I don't know, bang it out a lot faster. So it did come out in conceptually, but on the actual page, I had to really fight that thing.
So the older I get, the more I'm trying to pay attention to my health. And since I'm on the go a lot, I'm constantly looking for a healthy protein snack. This is why I was so excited when I came across Mosh Bars. You might have heard about Mosh Bars on Shark Tank. Mosh Bars were founded by Maria Shriver and her son, Patrick Schwarzenegger, with a simple mission to create a conversation about brain health through food, education, and research. So Mosh joined forces with the world's top scientists and functional nutritionists to go beyond your average protein bar. Each Mosh Bar is made with ingredients that actually support brain health, like ashwagandha, lion's mane, collagen, and omega-3s. Plus, Mosh is the first and only food brand boosted with cognizin, which is a premium nootropic that supplies the brain with a patented form of cetacloline. And Mosh Bars actually taste great. Okay, so some protein bars that are super healthy, you feel like you gotta like choke them down. Not so with Mosh Bars. It comes in 9 flavors, including chocolate chip cookie, hazelnut chocolate chip, and my personal favorite, peanut chocolate chip. Plus, Mosh actually donates a portion of all proceeds from your order to fund gender-based brain health research through the Women's Alzheimer's movement. So 2/3 of all Alzheimer's patients are women. So Mosh is working to close the gap between women and men's health research. So if you want to find ways to give back to others and fuel your body and brain, Mosh bars are the perfect choice for you. Head over to moshlife.com/theology to save 20% off plus free shipping on the Bestsellers trial pack or the new plant-based trial pack. Okay, so that's 20% off plus free shipping on either the Bestsellers trial pack or the plant-based trial pack at moshlife, moshlife.com/theology. Thank you, Mosh, for sponsoring this episode. Let's drill down into the three books within the book. So the first one, what's it? You title it the Ruiner?
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't leap off the pages, like in terms of like, what's this about? Why that title? And maybe highlight some distinct parts within that portion. And then we'll go through the other two portions and do the same.
Well, in terms of, like, I'm a titles kind of guy. I like, I really think a lot about, like, what to call the thing in such a way that encapsulates with some aesthetic consistency. And I do like there to be clarity and something cryptic kind of paired together. And I like it when titles kind of give up their immediate meaning to only to a degree. And then once you're kind of invested in the work, like you're like, oh, now I understand a little more why it's called what it's called. So Death of Deconstruction is an easy example that it's just like makes people upset when they see they're like, what the heck? I love and then ideally, if someone actually does read it with an open mind, you're like, oh, it wasn't exactly talking about what I thought he was talking about. It ends up being a lot more about even just life and death in general. So I like that kind of payoff, and I don't mind if it doesn't pay off to someone who's not fully invested. And I'm also like, the titles within the title, and I go into every book with like I need to know what the first line and the last line are going to be. Those are like the two most important bits of writing to me in the book. And then beneath those are the like kind of chapter headings or book titles. Ruiner was something that as soon as I started drafting and had an idea, okay, it'll be 3 books and there'll be these 3 things, that word came to mind, and I just put it as a placeholder because it wasn't even immediately evident to me. Like, where does that come from? Is it some, like it just sounds cool to me, or is there some subconscious thing there? And I was like, I'll put it on, I'll probably end up changing it. But the more that I wrote, the more that I felt like I was populating the meaning of it. And then the folks at David C. Cook, the publisher, they put, I think it's a banner on some of the promotion of the book. It might be on the back of the book that says something about like following Jesus will ruin your life. And which isn't something I told them to do, but I think is consistent with the idea. This like being, everything came from the how to die idea and the Bonhoeffer quote that opens the book. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die.
Yeah.
And the Jesus word picture of take up your cross. And so the prerequisite to discipleship in Jesus's really provocative language is like, you got to give up everything that you thought you needed, and you have to, all the language that's now become deeply familiar to church culture about like you have to die to yourself. But it's such a really jarring way to invite someone into like, fully realized humanity, is you have to die and so I thought like, well, I mean, like in one sense, Ruiner kind of tells the story of humanity is a big predicament that, God made things good. We along, with evil in the world have kind of ruined everything. And so the story of the scriptures becomes God's rescue mission. And in another sense, Ruiner kind of prefaces what follows, which is the teachings of Jesus, in that like the expense of discipleship. You know what I mean?
I love that. Yeah, you have that famous Bonhoeffer quote, and then on the next page you have a quote by Nietzsche. This book belongs to the very few. I love that so much, man. That's it. Yeah, in reading the book, it keeps you on your toes. Like, especially if you read a lot of Christian nonfiction, you almost can be a passive reader where you almost can anticipate what's going to come next. And this book does not allow you to anticipate what's going to come next. How would you? What's the main? So this is kind of the meta narrative of Scripture, trying to get the overarching story down. What are some key, like, if someone is going to like summarize how the 66 books of the Bible kind of summarizes the meta narrative of Scripture? What are some like really key points that are really fundamental that you think people should grasp?
Well, so I've done it in a few big swoops in that first book in Ruiner. The one is the meta narrative proper, which is I think I call it something like a short note on the history of life and death, and then in that you do what you'll get at a seminary class, which is like creation and the fall, and then Israel and exile, and the big building blocks of the meta narrative, Jesus and the church and the renewal of all things. And encompassing all that in something that's a little more of a literary structure as opposed to the seminary structure. But then beyond that, you write that part and you kind of go like, that's it, right? And I started to look for, well, what are some components of the Hebrew Scriptures that people a lot smarter than me think are intended to encapsulate the story of God in a meaningful way. And right away you read like, well, Exodus is in many ways like the salvation story of the desert and the freedom, and it captures all those big movements in a way that well, the trick, I guess, is that like anytime the New Testament authors or Jesus himself call on something a lot to explain what's happening, then it probably has some kind of great meta significance for the entire story of the Bible. And then one that was surprising to me was Ruth. I read a lot of scholars that were arguing that Ruth, in a lot of ways, in a really simple and sweet kind of way, tells the story of, like lost hope and salvation and redemption in a way that and actually leads into the story of the Messiah in an explicit way through genealogy, but leads into it nonetheless. And I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. How do you retell Ruth in a way that's, and I liked the idea of it feeling to the reader a bit like you said, like you expect to get certain components. Maybe even Exodus is something, we've got the Prince of Egypt, so it's not like a lesser known book of the Bible. We've got Charlton Heston. But okay, so the meta narrative, Exodus, that kind of makes sense. And then Ruth, you know what I mean? But trying to put those stories on the page in such a way that's like, these are for many people really deeply familiar stories, and tell them from angles that might surprise them. The way that I did that was like, I'm actually praying through these passages, like using Lectio Divina, reflecting on the words. And, one kind of traditional Lectio Divina practice is like, okay, well, I'm putting myself in through the eyes of a character in the story, and like, what does it mean to read this and imagine that I might be Peter, or that I might whatever. And the more that I did that, I'm like, yeah, but this angle's really familiar, that angle's too familiar. And so the Exodus story, like at one point I was like, oh, what? I'm just reading the kind of slaughter of innocents, and like all these babies go into the Nile, which is again really familiar to the point of numbness. That like, that's a pretty barbaric and horrific, even amongst the stories in the Hebrew Scriptures. It's pretty wild. What was that like for like a mom? That you just imagine the scene itself, not like the lifetime that follows a tragedy like that or a trauma like that. And so the story of Exodus in Ruiner is told through the eyes of like a mother who had lost two sons to the Nile, and then experiences the redemptive work of God as an old woman, and is resistant to it because from where she stands is like, well, where was my salvation when I needed it? Which I feel is often the question that the disciple of Jesus asks when we see redemption and justice in the world. It's like, well, how come there's not more, or why didn't I have it in my time of need? So you're trying to make these things not like relatable in a lame, like it's just like you kind of way, but in a way that jars the reader back into how provocative the story is on the page. But we need like language and history and context to get to that scandal sometimes. So how do you like bring the reader right into it without having to do a bunch of, seminary work?
It's so good. Wow. Yeah, Ruth, I just spent some time recently in Ruth, and it is fascinating how, I don't know, deeply theological it is. I mean, in seminary, it's like, yeah, you got the genealogy at the end, and God uses this woman and grafts her into the genealogy of Jesus. And that, okay, so that alone is like, oh, wow, gosh, this is more than just a heartwarming story. But it's interesting that Ruth is set in the context of the Judges. Judges is basically the fall. It's like a expanded version of the fall, right? I mean, you have all these people just over and over and over echoing the sin of Adam. And then Ruth pops on the scene, and you even have some key words like chesed is used, I think, in chapter 3, that her covenant faithfulness, was praised among many or something. You have was it Leah and Rachel at the end? It says that, they helped build the house of what, Israel or David or something like that, and in that term build is used of like God building David a house that would ultimately lead to the Messiah. It's almost like you just have this like these layers of just theological depth in the book. And kinsman redeemer, obviously the theme of redemption and everything. So yeah, it's fascinating, man. It's so sad when books do get so familiar that, yeah, you kind of turn into autopilot when you're reading them. And yeah, your book does such a great job preventing that from happening. Okay, Sermon on the Mount. Why? I guess it's kind of a softball question, but why, of all the passages in the New Testament, why the Sermon on the Mount? Do you see this as kind of like the heart of Christian ethics, as many do?
Yeah, like this, not to be like punk rock about the Bible, but like even back when I was young or even on the fence or deconstructing myself, like the Sermon on the Mount was always the kind of this like, man, this thing is crazy, and the imagery in it is wild, and the invitation seems borderline unrealistic. But the heart of what was presented, even as a completely dumb adolescent, was just like, I think probably most people, it's like, it's not hard to like the even if you're looking at it like an impossible ideal, you're like, this sounds good. But then of course, the more you get into it and learn the depth of like scholarship, this is like the canon within the canon, that like the core teaching of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, and everything, and not just explicitly taught but inferred by it, like how everything in the teaching is relational, like it has to be carried out within the context of relationships. There's things that you take for granted that and obviously the heart of Jesus's teaching on nonviolence and the present, like everything that we get about enemy, like just and they're little blocks of text.
Yeah.
And you're in your New Testament that you're like, in this much writing, he says something that continues to provoke the entire world for hundreds and hundreds of years. That's some serious like artistic sophistication. As a teacher, it's like obviously without peer, and everything that you want to communicate about Christian life is condensed into the Sermon on the Mount. Like obviously, like I said earlier, the book's not meant to do everything, but I thought like if you can do the Sermon on the Mount, you could like contain the heart of discipleship in terms of like, the kingdom manifesto, or however you want to describe the Sermon on the Mount. I
haven't gotten there yet. So with the Sermon on the Mount, do you explicitly talk about nonviolence? Like, do you see that as kind of like how do I say it? Like, some people lean this direction, they go all the way, but we should all just generally love our enemies as a general posture. Or do you kind of push nonviolence as kind of like, this is a Christian ethic?
I think I probably pushed nonviolence as a Christian ethic. And the reason I say it like I don't even know is I will admit that, well, it's partly your fault, but I've been thinking along these lines for so long that there are certain things I take for granted about, and it's not, I do understand, and you're much more gracious about this than I am, but I do understand that there's like a spectrum of agreement and disagreement, and comes to like the application of nonviolence or enemy love. But one thing I was trying to do honestly is again, like I said, if you read all these different Bible scholars and everything they say, like, well, to understand this part, you have to understand this about Jerusalem, and you have to understand this about the ancient world, and there's this theory about the gate, but then there's this theory about the gate, and you want to get out of the weeds of being like, look, there's three theories, and you want to get out of the weeds of like, well, first you have to understand what this word means, and instead distill it down to where you can communicate the essence of those interpretations in a way that doesn't sound like an essay. And so, I don't think that I intended to be like, look, this is it. This is the only way. And so here's what it has to say about the military. Nothing like that. But I do present it as in the section, it's called the law of grace, as opposed to the law of retaliation. And I tried to summarize it in a way that I think is consistent with the way it was expressed and summarized by the early Christians, which is the, abstinence from violence and warfare. And then, I don't bring that to bear on like contemporary politics or anything like that, but I do summarize it in a way that and maybe someone will disagree with me, but I felt like it was like, if you look at the writings of the New Testament and the early church, like this is probably how they would have described it as well. And you do with that what you will. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I love that about your writing. Yeah. You're not afraid to say what you think. I mean, when it comes to nonviolence, I've over the years, I totally get that taking a position of absolute nonviolence, that in every case, in every situation, Christians should never use violence, which is where I end up landing. I'm sympathetic to people that say, yes, 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 but what about, but if an axe murderer is breaking into your home and wants to rape your wife and kids and chop off your head, then maybe in those situations, you can use violence. I'm like, okay, we can debate that. But if the overwhelming pattern and posture and commitment of the global Christian church is nonviolent, with some maybe individual exceptions, that's a world I can live in for sure. Those are tough questions. They really are. Like, what would I do when the axe murderer breaks in? Like I don't know.
The mother of all hypotheticals.
I know, right? Yeah, like I'd probably grab a bigger axe. I don't know, but if to me, it just seems pretty indisputable scripturally and even historically speaking. I guess maybe prior to Augustine, historically speaking, that the global Christian church should be known as a passionate, non-violent people, so that when countries are at war with each other and civilians are being massacred, the Christians aren't supporting that. They're like, that's evil, and you are an evil nation, and you should repent, and God's going to judge you. Whether you're a Christian living in China protesting what its government's doing somewhere else, or whether you're a Christian living in the country now called America and all the many wars that country is involved, like the Christian church should be known for, first of all, not getting on board with that, let alone supporting it, but like protesting it. Like, axe murderer breaks in, kill him. But our overwhelming general posture should be one of like, oh, that's the religion that does not resort to violence. They abhor violence. They protest violence. Like, I don't know. To me, that seems like a very, very basic reading of the New Testament, and a clear reading of the first 300 years of how early Christians read the New Testament. But Jesus whipped people in the temple, didn't he? I'm like, well, it doesn't quite say that, but okay, maybe if you're cleaning a temple and you need to snap a few tails with the whip. Okay. Again, maybe there are some fringe, instances, but the core of the gospel, I believe, is the death and resurrection of Jesus. You can debate that again. which is clearly a display of like conquering evil through nonviolence when he had legions of angels at his hand, when he could have just like, he could have like taken out the Roman Empire with a snap of his fingers, and he chose to submit to violence, and that has theological meaning according to 1 Peter 2 and other passages. So I don't know. I'm preaching to the choir, although people listening may not be part of the choir.
Honestly, I know you know this as well, but it seems to me that in all the very legitimate and often worthwhile discourse around and debate around nonviolence, what gets lost almost immediately is the essence of what Jesus communicates actually pretty clearly in the Sermon on the Mount in his whole like, well, you need to be like, in his language, perfect, or maybe a better way or a more understandable way for us to hear it is like, you need to be like brought to full maturity and completion like God, you know? And so it's like the emulation of the heart of God. And we kind of turn it into like an ethics thought experiment. I know I have like a bazillion times, and then you're kind of, and I'm with you. I know that this sounds like the most posery thing to say, but having kids like changes the, when people say the whole, as long as I've been thinking about nonviolence, you get that mother of all hypotheticals. Somebody breaks into your house or they got a gun. And I'm like, when will I ever be in the position where it's like the Wild West and I've got this gun here? Like, I don't even have a gun.
A loaded gun. You got a loaded gun nearby.
But sure, for the sake of a thought experiment, and when I hear stories about horrific things happening to children, like, I'm a broken person like everybody else. My mind goes to like, if, my own family and this happens to me, and you become in your heart a violent person, which reveals, I think, the essence of what Jesus was saying. So like, I think those conversations are obviously worthwhile because I engage them all the time or stir them up myself. But the question, well, it becomes questions of like what's practical or what you want to do, and not a question of like what does it mean to be a person of love that is even willing to love enemies to the degree that God loves his own enemies. I don't know exactly what that means in every single applicable situation per se, but it probably doesn't mean killing people. You know what I mean?
Right.
That's kind of and what would you do? I don't know what I would do. I'm pretty busted. So I hope that I could be a person empowered by the Spirit to think of an option aside from kill or be killed. I don't know that I would. I definitely don't have a gun, so I'm screwed in the mother of all hypotheticals, at least. But yeah, and I think that's what I'm trying to do in the book anyway, too. It's like one thing I say early on and again throughout the book is like that all of life is configured for the destruction of the religious imagination. And by that, I mean that like the way that we approach these conversations, even Christian ethics, is in a way that's not like Holy Spirit empowered thinking and like, man, how could there be more grace? How could we embody the love of God? It's more like, well, what would you do? And what does it make sense in a geopolitical sense? Like those kinds of questions.
That's good. All right. Last section, the last book is on discipleship. You talk about, spiritual disciplines. What does it mean to follow Jesus? You did talk about prayer and silence and solitude and fast. Your short description of fasting was extremely good. My wife and I talk about this all the time. It's like, what is fasting? Like, what is it? I'm like, I just, it's in scripture. It's kind of assumed that you should do it, but it doesn't really spell out like what's the function or purpose, what's for prayer. It's like, what does that mean? Like every time you get a hunger pain, you pray or whatever. Basically a page, a little more than a page is so good. Yeah. I guess I can read it. I'm not going to read it. It's on page 212. Somebody else can go read it. But give us like what your vision of discipleship seems pretty hardcore. I mean, the title of the book is How to Die. This is death to self. This is hard. This is rigorous. Is there joy in dying to self? Like how do you mitigate or navigate that tension between the rigorousness of the Christian life with also this is the most joy-filled, meaningful life you can live?
Yeah, well, I mean, honestly, I went through a pretty significant theological shift in my thinking while I was writing the book. And so it started to color the draft while I was working on it the first time. And, obviously, you go through several drafts of these things. And so then it started to like reshape subsequent drafts of the book, in which I'd always planned, like I said, to do the Bible, Sermon on the Mount, and then pragmatic stuff. And you, of course, can't contain all the pragmatic stuff, but you can, like, I'm looking at it on a board and going, well, what do I think is like crucial to communicate to the disciple of Jesus for what it means to live into the things taught by the Sermon on the Mount? And so, things like prayer and things like fasting is mentioned in the Sermon on the Mount. So we got to bring that up, that kind of thing. And I had spent years and kind of participating in what will probably at some point be referred to as something like the new spiritual formation movement.
Like
I don't
via
have anything bad to say.
John Mark Comer, like
by my friend John Mark, and he and I, 10 years ago, we wrote the first year of what would become his whole practicing the way thing, as like beta practices. And we were like, you'll test them in your small group, I'll test them in my small group, and we'll come back together and see what we think about it. And obviously that line of thinking was informed by writers like Dallas Willard, or Richard Foster, kind of formation based on spiritual disciplines, and all really great stuff. Like, I don't have a punchline that's like, and it's bad. It's all really great stuff. But 10 years into it, and this is a fault of mine, not of the thinking or the movement or of John Mark or anything like that, but 10 years into it, I start to, and I'm not like a type A personality or what, if you like this kind of thing, an Enneagram 1 or anything, like my wife is, I'm the opposite. So I don't think in terms of like achievables, and I don't think in terms of like doing the thing to get the thing. But I realized that I had somehow, if only subconsciously, kind of bought into, even though I'd never taught this, I taught the opposite, but like, will you do the spiritual discipline to get the maturity? And that's important. Like you're intended to grow as a disciple of Jesus. That's what spiritual formation is. You're being formed more and more over time. And so these practices are the means by which you grow. And so they're like levels in a video game. You beat this level and you get further, along in the journey and closer to the goal. And I was talking with I have a spiritual director, and I was talking with him and explaining these things. And he's like, what the heck are you talking about? And he's like, how is this not something he asked me was like, how is that not a theology of duty? You do the thing to get the thing. And I was like, oh, no. That's not what I said, and that's not what I teach. And he's like, no, I'm pretty sure that's exactly what you said. And you realize that like, I've definitely experienced like a monumental change through the practice of what we would call spiritual disciplines. You know what I mean? Like, I've been changed through prayer or worship or even fasting, which I've, picked up in my adult life, is something that has been really meaningful to me. So I know that these are tools that create space to meet with God or to be affected by God. But then there's also times in my life, and certainly many times where I've witnessed this in others, where the love of God changes someone exponentially in an evening through no proper practice at all. You know what I mean? Like, just through like they're at a dinner with a friend and someone speaks something over them prophetically, and by that I mean like, the Holy Spirit kind of thing, and oh my gosh, like scales fall off the eyes, and people have stories. I have stories like that where you're like, someone said this to me and that really changed the way I think about myself and God. Or it's like something that no one could possibly contrive. Is like, it's during worship at church, and through that, even though it's a familiar song, a familiar atmosphere, God breaks through, and the love of God changes people in ways that you can't outline in a practice rhythm. You know what I mean? And that to me became like, well, good grief. So how do you communicate this in a book? It's like, good luck. I don't know how you can't fabricate it. You can't contrive it. You can do these disciplines every single day and not be changed by the love of God.
Yeah, that's good.
And, a friend of mine, he says often that like the disciplines, they can form you, but they can deform you. They can make you more a person of legalism or a person bound to rhythms more than bound to like the heart of God. So that began to shape the way that I was writing, and the way that the book begins and ends, which has a lot more to do with like what it means to be the beloved of God and less to do with, you pray to get the thing, you fast to get the thing. But it doesn't change the fact that these rhythms, these disciplines and practices are not only in the scripture, they're certainly well represented across all Christian traditions for centuries. And so, I think that what I'm attempting to do is to create for the reader the possibility of like what a wild and beautiful thing it is to be the beloved of God. And then essentially say like, and here are resources for drawing your attention to the love of God. To me, that's where I'm at now, is that like a spiritual discipline is not a thing that you do to get better. It's not like training for the boxing match per se. It's a resource. It's a resource that turns your attention to what is already true, so that you can be brought more into the truth of who you are and who God is.
That feels less.
Which is why.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, like, I've peppered the parables of Jesus throughout the book, and I put the prodigal son at the very, very end of the book, and for that reason, to end with the love of God as opposed to prayer, fasting, solitude. Good luck. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it feels less transactional the way you frame it, and because I felt that in the way some people talk about spiritual disciplines. It does. They don't say it's transaction, but sometimes the way they describe it can feel like that a little bit. As you're talking, it made me think of like how I've shifted my thinking and why I exercise and work out. Back in the day when I was an athlete, I'd go lift weights, I would do sprints, I'd do all these things so I can get faster, so I can hit the ball farther, so I can be a better player. There was very much a do this so that. Whereas now, especially as somebody who sits a lot in front of a computer, I feel less human when I'm not exercising. To me, exercising is an essential part of being human and becoming more human, because God made our bodies and they're designed to do things and move. And when you're not doing that, you're not expressing and living into your full humanity. I feel that. I feel more human when I am integrating some kind of physical activity in my otherwise sedentary life. And I just wonder, spiritual disciplines. Again, maybe this analogy doesn't work. I'm going on the fly here, but like you're just being more Christian, living in more in tune with the pattern and life of Jesus. And could that have a, do this so that effect? Does it lead to more Christ likeness and joy? Yeah, I think so. But I don't know. My approach isn't transactionally longer. Does that work at all? Is that similar to what you're saying? Maybe not.
Oh yeah, I think that's actually a great
Okay.
metaphor. I'm happy to steal it.
Feel free.
I think, like in earlier stages of the Christian journey, disciplines will inevitably be understood as transactional, at least in kind of like a subconscious way, because you're like, I was told to read my Bible in the morning and pray, and it's not like God won't meet a person in that space. He has for me. I think that he will. I think God is willing to work powerfully, even in skewed theology, like because of his great love for people. But the exercise thing is a great point, because when I first started to exercise myself as part of like an actual program in life or a routine, do it to like, I want to look good, or like I want these benefits that are promised from exercise. And then eventually it's just like, oh, that was neat, I guess. And maybe you do get those benefits, in the way that you expected to get them. But for me now, it's kind of like I would like to be around as my kids grow, and as much as it depends on me, I would like to take responsibility for myself, and then of course you inadvertently still incur the benefits of, like, we know from science now that exercise contributes to mental and emotional health and things like that. So it's not like you don't get the thing, you do get the thing. But the motivation shifts, and the motivation is like, well, I know that this is part of what it means for me to responsibly embody my humanity.
It's good. Hey, do you have time to stick around for a few more minutes? I want to really shift gears and talk about, because you've been involved in the Christian music industry. I have some questions about the Christian music industry. This always seems to flare up from time to time. Recently, you have the whole situation with Michael Tate and the allegations, and then Newsboys and all that stuff. So I don't know. I just got some questions that I'd like to kind of ask you offline. So
hit me.
Cool.
I'm ready. These are going to be good.
If you would like to listen to our Extra Innings conversation where we peek behind the curtain of the Christian music industry, then head over to patreon.com/Theology in the Raw to become a member of the Theology in the Raw community.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.